Chapter 1. The Town of Ravenwood. The YouTube channel Revealed Mysteries had garnered a modest following thanks to its videos on paranormal phenomena. Although the three young members Luke, Daniel, and Sophie were known to exaggerate reality and had never found conclusive evidence of supernatural activities, their charisma and clever editing kept their followers hooked. Now, they were heading to a place that promised to be their most chilling investigation yet, the town of Ravenwood. Ravenwood was a small town nestled in the mountains, with a population of just a few thousand residents. The place seemed trapped in time, with stone houses and cobblestone streets that told stories of bygone days. The tranquility of Ravenwood hid a dark secret. In the last 3 years, 3 people had disappeared without a trace. Locals whispered about a portal that appeared at certain times, taking away those who dared to approach. Luke, the leader of the group, reviewed his notes as they drove along the winding road leading to the town.
3 disappearances in 3 years.
He said aloud.
And all associated with the legend of the Ravenwood portal. This could be our big break.
Sophie, in charge of historical research, reviewed the accounts of the locals.
Some residents claim to have seen the portal. They describe it as a luminous crack in the air, appearing near the old cemetery on full moon nights. It's said that once you enter, you disappear forever.
Daniel, responsible for technology and equipment, was more skeptical.
There's always a logical explanation for these phenomena. But who knows, maybe this time we'll find something fascinating.
Upon arriving in Ravenwood, the group headed to the house they had rented through Airbnb. It was an old house with a neglected garden and windows that creaked in the wind. The owner, a stern-looking elderly woman named Mrs. Amelia, greeted them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion.
I hope you're not here to cause trouble.
She warned them.
The town has had enough with the disappearances and the stories that scare the children.
Luke smiled calmly.
Don't worry, Ma. We're just here to document and understand what's going on. We'll respect the residents and their beliefs.
That afternoon, the group decided to take a stroll around the town and get familiar with the place. They visited the main square, where an old clock marked the slow pace of life in Ravenwood. They spoke with some locals who were reluctant to discuss the disappearances in the portal. Finally, they arrived at the old cemetery, the epicenter of the legends. It was a gloomy and desolate place, with tombstones covered in moss and an air of abandonment. Daniel set up the equipment to record, while Sophie read aloud an excerpt from a local newspaper describing the latest disappearance.
John Smith, 34 years old, last seen near the cemetery on a full moon night. Witnesses claim to have seen a bright light and a figure disappearing into the air.
And here we are,
said Luke, looking at the camera.
ready to uncover the truth behind the Ravenwood portal. We'll stay for a week, exploring the town and talking to the residents. Is it all an urban legend, or will we find something more? Don't miss our upcoming videos. Until next time, mystery lovers.
With that, the 3 YouTubers began their first night in Ravenwood. Chapter 2. The Routine of the Mysterious. The first few days in Ravenwood proved to be a disappointment for the young folks of Revealed Mysteries. Luke, Sophie, and Daniel roamed the town, camera in hand, in search of any hint of paranormal activity. However, the reality of the place was much less exciting than the stories they had read. Ravenwood, with its tranquil routine and reserved inhabitants, seemed to be trapped in an eternal lethargy. The cobblestone streets were empty most of the time, and the few locals they encountered were reluctant to talk about the disappearances and the alleged portal. On their 3rd day, they finally found Mr. Michael, an elderly man who had lived his whole life in Ravenwood. Although his voice trembled and his eyes revealed a life of experiences, his stories were vague and confusing.
My grandfather used to say that there's a gateway to the beyond in the cemetery.
Mr. Michael said, puffing on his pipe.
But I never saw anything with my own eyes. Just stories, you know. Stories to scare the kids.
The 3 YouTubers listened attentively, but the answers they received were always similar. Everyone in Ravenwood seemed to know the legend, but no one had concrete evidence or detailed accounts. The only evidence they managed to obtain were some old newspapers detailing the latest disappearance, that of John Smith. The local newspaper described the disappearance in sensational language. John Smith, 34 years old, was last seen near the cemetery on a full moon night. Several witnesses claim to have seen a bright light and a figure disappearing into the air. The community fears that the legend of the portal has claimed another victim. Upon reading this, Sophie got excited.
This is the closest thing to a lead we've had,
She said, showing the clipping to her companions.
If there's anything to see, it'll probably happen on the anniversary of his disappearance.
The 5th day in Ravenwood coincided with the first anniversary of John Smith's disappearance. They decided to spend the whole night in the cemetery, hoping that something extraordinary would happen. They arrived at the location at dusk, prepared with cameras, flashlights, and enough coffee to stay awake. The hours passed slowly. The cemetery, with its eerie atmosphere and the whisper of the wind among the tombstones, offered nothing more than a sense of unease. Daniel paced back and forth, constantly checking the recording equipment. Luke and Sophie sat next to an old tomb, trying to stay alert.
Look, Sophie, this is turning out to be a waste of time.
Luke murmured, yawning.
Maybe it's just small town stories, nothing more.
Sophie nodded wearily.
I know, but we have to try. If nothing happens tonight, we'll leave tomorrow.
The night went on, and the full moon illuminated the cemetery with a pale and ghostly light. But in the end, nothing happened. There were no mysterious lights, no shining portals, no inexplicable disappearances. Just silence and the rustle of branches in the wind. At dawn, exhausted and disappointed, the three decided to return to the house. As they packed up the equipment, Luke made one final recording for his channel.
Friends of Revealed Mysteries, we spent the night in the Ravenwood Cemetery hoping for something extraordinary. Unfortunately, we found nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes legends are just that, legends. But don't worry, we'll keep searching for the truth. Until next time.
With that, they retired to their accommodation, exhausted and disillusioned. Already in the house, they seriously considered leaving the town, convinced that there was not much more to investigate. Chapter 3. Daytime Mysteries. The next day, Luke, Sophie, and Daniel woke up in the old house, tired but determined to continue with their routine. As they prepared breakfast, the discussion about whether to stay or leave became inevitable.
We haven't gotten much material for the channel.
Sophie said as she poured coffee into her cup.
But honestly, there's not much else to do here.
I agree.
Daniel replied.
Yesterday was a total waste.
Luke nodded.
Let's finish breakfast, talk to the old lady to return the key, and get out of here.
When they tried to communicate with Donna Emilia, they realized their cell phones were off, out of battery.
Maybe the long night wore them out.
Luke suggested. They plugged the phones in to charge, but soon realized there was no electricity in the house.
This can't be.
Daniel said, frustrated.
What do we do now? We don't know where Donna Emilia lives.
Maybe we should wait until the afternoon and take the opportunity to explore the town a bit more.
Sophie suggested. They went out to explore Ravenwood, but found the place quieter than they had seen before. The streets were practically empty. Not even the chickens and other animals they had seen before were present.
This is strange.
Luke commented as they walked through the deserted streets.
But maybe we can still get some more shots.
When they tried to use the cameras, they discovered that they were also out of battery.
This is getting too weird.
Daniel said, puzzled. They decided to knock on some doors to inquire about Donna Emilia and the lack of electricity. However, they received no answer at any house.
Maybe it's siesta time.
Sophie suggested, though her voice betrayed concern. The day went on, and their concern grew. They wanted to leave, but upon returning to the house and deciding to leave the key at the door and go, they discovered that the car wasn't working.
This can't be.
Luke exclaimed, desperate.
What's going on here?
It was already late, and with no electricity and no way to communicate, they considered staying another day.
Maybe things will return to normal tomorrow.
Sophie said, trying to stay calm. With that, they resigned themselves to spending another night in Ravenwood, hoping that the next day would bring them answers and a way out of this enigmatic town. Chapter 4. The Night of Profound Mystery. As the night progressed, the house was enveloped in a penetrating cold, a sensation that seeped into the bones of Luke, Sophie, and Daniel. The wind, now sharper, seemed to whisper in the cracks of the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere that prevented them from falling asleep. They lit the fire in the stove, but the flames seemed to struggle against the darkness looming outside. They looked out the windows, only to be greeted by the sight of thick fog enveloping the town in a cold embrace. The wind, blowing fiercely, seemed to carry with it indecipherable whispers that vanished into the air. The electricity still hadn't returned, plunging the house into an almost palpable darkness. Ironically, and with a knot of fear in their stomachs, the three young people found themselves nervously laughing at the surreal situation they were in, wishing they hadn't craved a paranormal experience so much. The wind, which had been just a distant whisper at first, began to intensify, pounding on the wooden house, as if trying to break in. Come out, it seemed to whisper with a voice echoing in their minds, inviting them to venture beyond the safety of the house. The fog, thick as smoke, began to cover the windows, reducing visibility to a few meters. Through it, the dark contours of human figures began to take shape, appearing and disappearing in the fog like wandering specters. With their hearts pounding in their chests, they decided to open the door to confront what was outside. As they did, they were met with a sea of pale, expressionless faces, silent and still like statues in the mist. They tried to communicate with them, but their words were lost in the wind and the fog. They received no response from the specters, whose presence silenced the atmosphere. None dared to take a step beyond the threshold of the house, fearful of what might happen if they did. With a shiver running down their spines, they closed the door with a dull thud, feeling the weight of the mystery crushing them to the ground. As the whispers in the wind continued, the figures seemed to draw closer and closer to the house, almost as if they were within reach. Each knock on the door echoed like a heartbeat in their minds, reminding them that they were trapped in a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. The hours passed endlessly, and dawn seemed farther away than ever. They were tired, exhausted both physically and mentally, but sleep eluded them like an elusive dream that refused to come. Time seemed to stand still, as if the clock itself had stopped working in that enchanted place. Finally, overcome by exhaustion and terror, they fell into a restless sleep, hoping that morning would bring an end to their nightmare. Chapter 5. The Eternal Night. They woke up still in the night. It seemed as if time wasn't moving forward. The fire in the stove was barely a dying ember. The cold was unbearable, and darkness shrouded the house in its somber cloak. Luke, the first to awaken, with trembling hand, they tried to stoke the fire, but the fog began to seep through the cracks in the house, enveloping them in almost total darkness. With effort, they managed to kindle more wood and huddled close to the heat desperately, trying to fend off the invading cold. But then, something strange began to happen. The furniture around them started to disappear slowly, as if being devoured by the fog and darkness. Soon, only they remained, solitary in the midst of a sea of shadows. And then, they began to see it a dense and palpable darkness, like a living entity looming over them. It extended from the walls and the floor, enveloping them in its icy embrace. The room descended into a sepulchral silence, broken only by the dull sound of their hearts hammering in their chests. Panic consumed them entirely. Sophie, gripped by terror, felt a visceral urgency that propelled her to run towards the door, screaming madly. "We have to get out of here," she exclaimed, her eyes filled with panic and determination. Luke and Daniel, paralyzed by fear, shouted her name, pleading for her to stop, but it was as if she were possessed by a force beyond her control. With each step she took towards the door, the darkness seemed to swallow her, drawing her into its deadly embrace. The screams of agony followed that scene. Sophie pleaded for help with heart-wrenching screams, but neither Luke nor Daniel dared to leave their place by the fire. In the surrounding darkness, the images of people seemed to draw closer and closer. Motionless, frozen with terror, Lucas and Daniel were already almost in total darkness and surrounded by a somber presence. Unexpectedly, and without even realizing it, they were dragged into the darkness, where the entity tore them apart without even realizing what happened, devouring their souls and leaving only the echo of their screams in Ravenwood's infinite night. In the end, Ravenwood's eternal night leaves us with a lesson about respect for the unknown and the importance of knowing when it's time to retreat. In a world full of mysteries and legends, it's crucial to remember that some doors are better left closed, and that true wisdom sometimes lies in accepting our limitations and recognizing when it's time to return to the safety of the known. And so ends the chilling tale of Ravenwood. If you enjoy mysterious stories, subscribe to Mysteries Uncharted and hit the bell for more spine-tingling tales. See you on our next adventure.